Good evening, Greg, and good evening, everybody who's online with us.
Good evening.
Welcome to the last Equipped Live of 2024. I cannot believe how fast this year went by, but here we are. We are going to continue with the list of questions that were submitted in advance for Greg to answer from employees of ESI clients throughout the IFMC. So we are going to just dive right in. Are you ready for these, Greg?
I hope so.
I hope so too. All right. So last time we shuffled the questions around a little bit from the way we had them because the question we were talking about last time was about Greg running for president. And so we thought maybe some of these could flow a little bit into that same conversation we were having. And the question about a job function that you may have given up or delegated over the last couple of years that you really enjoyed. So kind of on that same note, first question from AMI, Jeff Bodine submitted this. Who have been or continue to be some of your greatest mentors?
That's an interesting question. And I've learned from and certainly have been influenced by a number of people over the years, but I'm not sure any of them would have called themselves mentors. And so I haven't really been involved in a formal mentoring arrangement. Maybe you could call it informal. I would think the closest to mentoring was my dad. And of course, he was also my dad. But and so I did learn, he was the kind of guy that didn't preach ethics, but he lived the IFMC values. And so from that perspective, that was just very beneficial, and I learned a lot from that. I think he was the closest thing I really did have, though, to a formal mentor, because he was just a master at figuring out what I wanted, not giving it to me, but showing me how to get it. And he just did that over and over and over. And I didn't really realize that was happening until later. And if I was making too fast a progress, I'm pretty convinced he threw a few extra hurdles in there just so I learned. But I think that's probably the closest I came to formal mentoring, which ironically today is the 38th anniversary of when my dad passed away. He passed away on this day. So, but hands down, he's the person that I was the most influenced by. If I look at others, and maybe there's just a lot of them, and I've learned from a lot of people and been influenced by them. If I maybe start out and look at just industry groups, if you will, and how I learned, and if I start with business, because that's certainly something I have spent a lot of time and effort on. In my early days, again, I don't think these fellows would think they were mentoring me, but I think I was just flailing around and trying really hard, and I think they just maybe even felt sorry for me and wanted to help me out. I don't know. But if I look at the banking and the finance industry, two guys really come to mind there. One is Fred Wismer from People's Bank and Trust, who he's no longer with us, and then Patty Kamishek's dad at Besser Credit Union. And with both those fellows, I was borrowing money. Of course, they had a real interest in just whether or not I was going to be able to pay that back. And so we ended up in conversations that are pretty deep, pretty personal about just what it is you're doing. And of course, they were very much senior to where I was at the time, and were pretty, I thought, pretty free with advice on how I should be doing things. And so that was very helpful. Supply chain was George Stevens at Besser Company, and George was Gary Stevens' grandfather. And so while George was a customer, I had reasons to deal with him occasionally, and again, just a really helpful fellow that explained a lot. from there, if I look at most of the learning beyond that, it was really a result of being on different boards of directors. And one of the first ones, I was pretty young. I was in my 20s at the time, but that was on the board of the Greater Alpena Area Industrial Development Corp., which is the predecessor to Target. And Russ Townsend from R.A. Townsend was there, and Russ was just a gem. I'm pretty sure I was flailing around just trying to do what I thought was good stuff, and he really helped me understand economic development, helped me understand how communities work, and really helped open my eyes to the differences between for-profit businesses and nonprofit. And so that was really helpful. I really learned a lot from Russ. If I look at federal government and understanding federal government, I probably got most of that from Dwayne Ackley, and that was more recently when I served on a board with Dwayne. And Dwayne had a really interesting history. Dwayne was an attorney who, in his early days as an attorney, so I think he was in his 30s, he ended up in a lawsuit representing a trucking company against the Teamsters. And he ended up winning against Teamsters Local and the Teamsters International. That ended up being appealed back and forth. In the process, he interviewed or deposed Jimmy Hoffa. Yeah, and he ended up going on to the Nebraska Supreme Court and prevailed against Teamsters International and got treble damages, which is 3 times the judgment. He is the only guy in history, at least as of a while ago, and I'm sure we would have heard about this if it happened recently, but he's the only guy that ever got treble damages against Teamsters International. So really interesting, sharp guy. When he did that, of course, now he became a rock star in the trucking industry and ended up as the president of the American Trucking Association. And for most people that don't know this, the American Trucking Association is one of the biggest lobbying organizations in Washington, D.C. And so he knew all the players in Washington, D.C. and had just a really, really good insight on that. And I was fortunate enough to get to know Dwayne pretty well and have him tell stories about that. So that was really helpful. If I look then at the insurance business, again, served on a board with Vince Trocino, who was the president of State Farm Insurance. And so Vince obviously understood the insurance industry because of his role was on a number of different boards of directors and with organizations like Brookings Institute and all some pretty important organizations. So again, just had a really, really good insight on all sorts of things in addition to the insurance industry. If I go back to business a little bit and look at corporate governance, a fellow by the name of Jim Milliken was really helpful there. And Jim was senior VP and general counsel for Toyota for a while, Toyota Motor Car Company. Then went on to be the executive vice president of International Paper, and then was on the executive committee of the National Association of Manufacturers. And he's a really sharp guy, understands the law, understands corporate governance and how to govern organizations. So helpful guy there. International business is Jim Shields. And Jim was interesting. And it turns out Jim Milliken and Jim Shields are still with us, still alive. Unfortunately, Vince Trocino and Dwayne are not. But Jim headed up the retail distribution for British Petroleum in Russia. And so he had a real insight on regulation and how things theoretically work and then how they really work in Russia. And he's a really interesting guy to talk to. So I've been talking a lot about old guys, but there is a young guy in his 40s that has really been helpful for me as well. And I've learned a lot about, again, nonprofits and government, but that's a fellow by the name of Taryn Bragdon. And I actually serve on a board for one of the organizations that he heads up right now. But his main organization is Foundation for Government Accountability. And essentially what that organization does is it proposes legislation both at the state government level and the federal government level, and mainly for conservative causes. But it's nonpartisan, but it is leaning conservative. But again, just a young fellow that really understands how government and nonprofits work, and so has been very helpful. Matter of fact, he was the youngest person ever elected in the state of Maine to the state legislature. So interesting.
That's why that name's familiar. Yep. So you mentioned your dad in the way that he kind of taught you, let you figured out what you wanted, then helped you get there, but didn't just give it to you. I've heard a few of these stories from you. Would you be willing to share a specific story about that?
Sure. We had, I was really fortunate in that we had a workshop on the farm, or my dad had a workshop, but that was not your ordinary workshop. It had very old, it was line shaft style machinery. So stuff from the real early days, but we had cobbled together 110 volt single phase motors to run it and so forth. But we had a drill press and a saw and so forth. And one of the projects that I got really excited about was I wanted a mini bike. And of course, my dad wouldn't give me the mini bike, but he gave me a cow. And what do I do with this?
Right.
Well, if you want, there's an auction in Emerson every Friday. We can take the cow to the auction. You can sell it. You can buy a mini bike. But if I were you, I would think about that. I would wait until that cow has a calf. I would sell the calf. And then the next year I would sell another calf and another calf. And this was early in the week. There was no question in my mind that cow was going to the auction. But by Thursday, I was starting to see the wisdom, and I really realized that, boy, if I play this right, and that's making money for me when I'm sleeping. And so I ended up keeping the cow, but then I was really interested in converting a bicycle into a motorcycle. And so I asked my dad if I could use his chainsaw, because I had figured out that the chainsaw motor would fit into the frame. And his answer, sure, use it. Well, the chainsaw probably cost more than the mini bike, but
yes.
he probably knew it was not going to work, but he knew I was going to learn. And so I did get the chainsaw motor kind of hose clamped in place and cobbled together. But then I realized that the chain was actually driving in the wrong direction. And so all it would do is put the brake on, and I needed to make a little gearbox up. And so now I needed to get some parts welded up. And at the time, we didn't have a welder on the farm. So I asked my dad if we could go to Hubbard Lake and go to Dagan Brothers and have them weld these parts up. And his answer was, no, not right now. Well, the next day when he came home from work, he had a welder.
Oh, and you were going to weld those parts up.
And he basically said, figure it out. And so I figured it out enough to cobble that all together. but it never did. It never did work. I never did get hurt on it either. So,
Right. Did
but
you
that's
ever,
the kind of stuff.
well, did you ever
That's the
get
kind.
an actual mini bike?
No,
No.
no, but I did go from there to trying to make a snowmobile out of plywood.
Oh boy.
And he was willing to let me use the Wisconsin motor off of our New Holland baler for that little project. And again, that was one that never worked. But boy, did I learn a lot. And I'm convinced he knew it wasn't going to work.
Uh-huh.
He knew I was going to break stuff and ruin some tools. But he knew that was a cheap education.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I love that story. I have heard that cow story before, and I love that story. I think it's just a great way to raise children, is to let them figure things out on their own and make mistakes. And yeah, it's wonderful. So I want to ask one more question. Has to do with the mentors topic. You do read a lot, and you study other businesses and what people are doing. So talking about, and I know you're what we would say as a self-learner. So is there any book or author in particular that has sort of mentored you unofficially because it's something that you followed and picked up a lot from?
Probably the book that there's actually two books that I've recommended more than any others. And so I've probably spent the most time explaining those. And so if I just look at that and say, okay, that's probably what impacted me the most. That's why I'm doing that. And one is 7 Habits of Highly Effective
Yes.
People with Stephen Covey. The other is Self-Deception. Forget the title of it. But
Go ahead.
there's self-deception in the title, and it's a relatively short book, to the point. It's kind of a story, but I've had more people read that and tell me that changed their life. So that's a good one. I just wish I could remember the title to it right now.
Is it Leadership and Self-Deception?
It is.
It is.
Okay. I think Paul and I were probably both Googling that at the same time.
I have the book in my hand.
Oh, excellent. So those are books, and those I'm familiar with. Actually, those are not difficult reads. So they would be either of them would be a great book for anybody listening to pick up and, learn some of those same things that you have now said have been so valuable to you.
I would
So,
agree.
yeah, so we really only talked about one question today, but I liked the conversation. It was a lot of fun. Do you have anything that you would like to end this session with?
Well, I think the thing that I would encourage people to do is focus on helping others. And so in the real early days, I was flailing around. Other people were helping me. When I started getting on boards of directors, voluntarily helping others, not getting paid for it, that really exposed me to other folks that were like-minded, but way more competent than I was with certain topics. And so that was really beneficial. And there's not a lot of doubt in my mind that was beneficial for me. My guess is the reason I keep getting invited to join boards is because I must be helping others as well. Mm-hmm. And so that's just a pretty rewarding type of activity. So I'd encourage others to get involved in the community, try to help others.
There's no shortage of opportunities to get involved. So excellent advice. All right, so we do have the next Equipped Live scheduled for January 20th. An email will go out closer to that date, but if you want to mark your calendars, you can do that. Greg, have a wonderful holiday season. We'll be in touch after the first of the year. So thank you so much for joining us, and everybody have a wonderful holiday.
Thank you. Merry Christmas, everyone.